And so we're having a rainy day, but we are excited to be connecting with you long distance, all the way from our nation's capital. And today we will be doing a program in which you will be sent back in time 150 years to the assassination of President Lincoln. Which, does anyone know when that happened? Not how many years ago, because I just told you. Yes, in the green shirt.
April 14th, 1865, 10:22.
Perfect. All right. Well, yeah, I would give you a high five through the internet. Awesome. Okay, cool. Well, without further ado, prepare yourselves to go back in time, and I will introduce to you Detective James McDevitt.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Detective James McDevitt of the Washington Metropolitan Police Force. It is my privilege to welcome you and thank you for joining me here today. In the name of President Andrew Johnson and the direction of Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War, I have been asked to revisit with you the events of April 14th and 15th in this year, 1865, in order to confirm the results of our investigation into the assassination of our late lamented President Abraham Lincoln and the attempt on the life of the Secretary of State, the Honorable William Seward. By the end of our time together, I hope to be able, with your help, to answer the following questions. 1. Was the assassination of the President a lone act or a conspiracy? Well, let me ask you, before we proceed, how would you define the word conspiracy?
He's talking to you. What is
a plot or a plan? Very good. For the purposes of our investigation, we will consider it when a group of people get together to plot or plan something that is wrong or against the law. So in this case, we must decide whether the assassination of the President was a lone act or a conspiracy. Now, if it was a conspiracy involving multiple people, who was involved in this conspiracy? And finally, is there a connection between the assassination of the President and the attempt on the life of the Secretary of State? Let me begin by asking, where in the country are you joining me from today?
Iowa.
Iowa. Very good. Our 29th state. Can you tell me which side you fought on during this most recent Civil War? On the north side, or the Union side. That is correct. Now, I would remind you that while Washington is our nation's capital, it remains in very many ways a southern city, and that may play a part in the events you'll examine today. This is Ford's Theater. John T. Ford, proprietor. He built his first theater here in 1861. A structure burned to the ground in 1862 and was replaced by this one in 1863. It's one of the finest theaters in the country, home to some of the greatest performances of the American stage. Unfortunately, as you can see, it has been closed on orders of Secretary of War Stanton. There have been death threats against the Ford family, as well as a number of credible threats to burn this building to the ground. Regrettably, the events of a single evening have turned this from a place of diversion into the most notorious crime scene in the country. Now let me take you back to that night. Ironically, it was Good Friday, a day of penance and reflection. But Washington was still in the throes of a massive celebration marking the end of the Great Civil War. Thousands of people filled the streets, dancing, drinking, singing, setting great bonfires. Now, the climax of this celebration had occurred the night before, on Thursday evening, when Washington was ablaze with a grand illumination. Every public building was extravagantly lit with gaslight, and fireworks displays filled the evening sky. Friday was quieter, perhaps because the weather turned drizzly, or perhaps because Washington was suffering from a citywide hangover. You decide. Either way, this section of 10th Street remained busy because it had been widely known since morning that Ford was putting on a play, Our American Cousin, and that the President and Mrs. Lincoln were to be in attendance along with General and Mrs. Ulysses S. Grant. The crowds came early and packed the theater. The Grants, however, chose to go home to New Jersey that afternoon, so the Lincolns were joined instead by Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. At approximately 25 minutes, or approximately 8:30 p.m. rather, the presidential carriage arrived in front of Ford's Theater, and President Lincoln went through the main doors. As he did, the packed house erupted into cheering for the man who had saved the Union. That night, I was on duty at Metropolitan Police Headquarters at the corner of 10th and East Streets, about a block and a half away from the theater. At 25 minutes after 10, I heard a low rumble coming from up the street. I stepped out to see what might be happening when I was pushed back by a rush of men with the most astounding news. The president had been shot. Somehow, someone got into the state box, and though not everyone in the packed house heard the pistol fire, they all saw what happened next. A man dressed all in black leaping to the stage with a shout and escaping through the back of the theater. Even more astounding was the identity of the assassin. Dozens of witnesses were in complete agreement that the man who shot the president was the actor, John Wilkes Booth. Now you may know him as the younger brother of the famous Shakespearean actor Edwin Booth, but John Wilkes is a star in his own right, famous throughout the country, though only 26 years of age. There have always been rumors of his southern sympathies, but how is this possible? How could he, in front of a packed house, get into the presidential box, shoot the president, and escape untouched? Did he act alone, or did he have assistance? For the 30 minutes following the assassination, we interviewed some 16 witnesses. Their testimony pointed to something vast and unprecedented happening in Washington, a wholesale assault on the highest levels of government. One witness heard the Secretary of State had been murdered in his home in Lafayette Park. Another, that the Vice President had been shot in his hotel room. It was believed that General Grant had been assassinated while changing trains in Baltimore, and that at that very moment, Confederate cavalry was marching on Washington, and that hundreds of Southern prisoners in the old Capitol prison had broken out, vowing revenge. The hard-fought victory of the last 4 years of war would collapse in fear and chaos before our very eyes. And here, in the middle of 10th Street, a company of soldiers pushed its way through the crowd, carrying the president to the house across the way, leaving a trail of his blood in their wake. Now, the house across the way is Peterson's boarding house, and by midnight, Peterson's boarding house was not only the scene of the final struggle of Abraham Lincoln, it was also the center of the United States government. Cabinet members and military officials had pushed their way through the crowd and ultimately inside Peterson's boarding house. Secretary of War Stanton simply abandoned his carriage at the corner of F Street, waded into the mob, and finally up these stairs. But he must have realized that if there were a Southern insurrection, Peterson's boarding house was now the largest target in the country. Anyone who wanted to finish off the federal government need only bring Peterson's boarding house to the ground. Realizing this, Secretary of War Stanton sent out immediate orders for the police to secure the block. We pushed back the crowds and set guards here at the front steps. A little before midnight, the president's oldest son, Robert, arrived and went inside, and from the front parlor, the wails of Mrs. Lincoln could be heard. At one point, I heard her scream, "Why didn't he shoot me?" Even to a hardened policeman, this was unbearable. So it came as a relief when a new set of orders came out from Secretary of War Stanton. He wanted an immediate investigation into the crime, or rather crimes. As we now knew, the Secretary of State had indeed been attacked in his home in Lafayette Park, stabbed nearly to death. Every available detective from the Provost Marshal's office, the Defense of Washington, and the Metropolitan Police were dispatched throughout the city to find anyone who may have known or come in contact with John Wilkes Booth. How did he escape? Where is he headed? If this is a conspiracy, how many other people are involved, and who are they? Well, as forces dispersed throughout the city, ours began where Booth's flight commenced, the back of Ford's Theater. So we're going to head in that direction to begin our investigation. But as we begin the investigation, I invite you to follow along and look for the many conspirators that will arise through the course of this investigation. Feel free in the packet in front of you to take notes on these conspirators, because we will later revisit their fate as to their guilt or innocence in this conspiracy. Now, this is Baptist Alley. This is named for the church that Ford's Theater replaced. This is the alley directly behind Ford's Theater. And not pictured here, but at the base of this alley is a shed. A shed that has been turned into a stable by Ford's Theater stagehands. This was apparently done at the request of Booth. It is common for Forest Theater employees and stagehands to run errands and do odd jobs for Booth. So the question becomes, will any of them go so far as to help him commit the crime or make his escape? Well, even before the call of the detectives went out, my colleague, Sergeant Johnson, had made his way to this alley. He gave us the information about that shed, thinking perhaps Booth had left evidence there. None could be found. But he also encountered a very important witness here. A man who not only saw the assassination, but attempted to stop Booth from escaping. A man by the name of Major Joseph Stewart. I have here a statement from Major Stewart. I heard the shot fired, and saw a man dressed full in black leap upon the stage. He was wearing a large knife, and shouted what I heard to be a sick semper tyrannis, and thereupon fled through the scenery towards the rear of the theatre. I immediately bolted from my seat, climbed across the orchestra pit and gave chase, shouting, "Stop that man!" But no one moved. The stage door flew open ahead of me and then slammed shut. When I threw the door open again, I saw the silhouette of the man in the darkness. He was flinging himself onto the saddle of a horse and attempted to turn the animal around. I also heard the sound of a bar yelling in pain and thought perhaps that he'd been stabbed. But my chief thought was to seize the reins of the assassin's horse. I almost had him twice, but the rider circled quickly out of my grasp, then drew the reins around and spurred his horse up the alley. I ran after him some 40 or 50 yards, shouting at him to stop, but the man galloped hard to the left, and up the passageway to F Street, and was gone in a matter of seconds. Well, it turns out the young boy who was screaming in pain in the alley was young Johnny Burroughs. But he sold peanuts here at the theater, so everyone called him Peanut John. Well, he had been holding Booth's horse, waiting for him to emerge, and as Booth did so, swinging himself onto the horse, he kicked little Johnny hard to the ground. But Johnny was able to give us a description of the animal. A light bay mare, with a wavy tail, very uneasy by disposition. Now this sounds strangely like my ex-wife. But I digress. When asked how he came to be holding the animal used by a murderer to make his escape, little Johnny said, "Mr. Spangler told me to do it." Edmund Spangler, more commonly known as Ned, a Forest Theater stagehand engaged in general carpentry and scene-shifting during performances. He is known to be a friend of John Wilkes Booth and has been heard on more than one occasion to utter disparaging words about the president. One of his fellow stagehands said he recognized Booth as the assassin. Spangler slapped him and told him to keep quiet. Mr. Spangler cannot be found at the theater, and his whereabouts are not known at this time. Now, at this point in the investigation, we have a clear description of John Wilkes Booth, and we know the general direction in which he rode. But what is his ultimate destination? Some say Baltimore, Maryland. It is his home. He has friends and family there. Others say Virginia. But there is no way to ride easily directly from Washington into Virginia. Still others say Southern Maryland. Well, we know that it is rife with Confederate spies and sympathizers, the perfect place to hide, and just across the Navy Yard Bridge in southeast Washington. But whatever his ultimate destination, he had to begin by heading east on F Street, meaning he had to pass the Herndon House at the corner of 9th and F. Now, the Herndon House is a small 3-story hotel that has a reputation as a place in this city where those with Southern sympathies can find a room to lodge. It is not, however, one of the nicer hotels in the city, so it's doubtful if John Wilkes Booth ever spent much time there. But it sits on an important corner, so it's possible someone saw him make his escape. To that end, the wife of the proprietor, Mrs. Martha Murray, was briefly questioned. I have here a statement from Mrs. Murray. I apologize. It appears that Mr. Booth has been at the Herndon House, and recently. Yes, Mr. Booth has stayed at the Herndon House upon occasion. I cannot remember exactly when, but since he favors the National Hotel, it must have been time when he could not obtain a room there. But I never saw Mr. Booth at any time on Friday at all. But I do recollect seeing him on Thursday evening. I saw him and a group of men standing at the foot of the stairs talking with Mr. Kinsler. Now, I don't know much about Mr. Kinsler, not even his first name, or that he's a young man, perhaps 19 or 20 years of age, but very tall, something over 6 feet, I'd say, dark hair, very muscular. I had a feeling he'd been recommended to us by a young woman who come around in late March and found about between then since I've seen a young woman in the company of young John Surratt. Well, his mother keeps a boarding house up on H Street. Mrs. Surratt, that is. And I don't know why Mr. Kinsler didn't stay there, but perhaps they're full of. Anyhow, he took room 6 on the 3rd floor and stayed with us about 2 weeks. He left on Friday afternoon about 4 o'clock. When he left, he was wearing a light overcoat and a brown hat. I have not seen him since.
That was good information.
Another name, another possible suspect. A tall, muscular man, known only as Mr. Kinsler, visited by Booth Thursday night, left suddenly Friday afternoon, wearing a brown hat and light overcoat. Now, whether this is a real lead or a dead end remains to be seen, but Mrs. Murray gave us a piece of information more important than she could possibly have known. That being the name, John Surratt. You see, late Friday night at police headquarters, we received a tip, not regarding the assassination of the president, but the attempt on the life of the Secretary of State, the other crime we are investigating. I cannot divulge the source of this information, but suffice it to say that it's believed that John Surratt has a connection to John Wilkes Booth, and that Mr. Surratt, who may also be connected to Mr. Kinsler, is the man who carried out the bloody attack at the Seward home. To that end, my colleague, Detective Clarvo, was dispatched to the Surratt boarding house in the early morning hours of Saturday, April 15th, possibly to arrest a killer. But let me ask you, deputies, we must remain on the trail of whom?
Who are they looking for, guys?
We'll remain on the trail of John Wilkes Booth. Short of catching the man himself, we might learn a great deal from anything he left behind as he fled. Now, Mrs. Murray also told us that Booth preferred to stay at the National Hotel, one of the finest in the city. Well, that hotel is at Pennsylvania and 6th Streets, so we're going to head in that direction now. But before we arrive at the National Hotel, let me ask you, deputies, can anyone tell me what this building in the center of Washington, D.C. is?
White House.
White House is an excellent guess. It is close to the center, but this is another white building in the center of Washington. Congressional building, or the Capitol building. Now, this rendering is from 1862. This Capitol dome, which would appear now in 1865, is not completed yet, which is why this rendering shows the Capitol absent of the dome. But just 5 short blocks, 6 short blocks from the Capitol, sits the National Hotel. Now, this hotel backs onto a livery stable called Pumphrey's Stable, where someone could rent a horse. When the call to detectives went out, it was my colleague from the Provost Marshal's office, Lieutenant William Tyrrell, who arrived here first, and I have here a report that Mr. Tyrrell filed following his time at the National Hotel. I learned from the desk clerk that J.W. Booth checked into the hotel on April 8th. We went to Booth's room on the 4th floor, number 228, where I found a large wardrobe trunk with the name J. Wilkes Booth marked on the lid. I forced open the trunk and found within a box of pistol cartridges, 2 pairs of handcuffs, a blue dress coat with the insignia of a colonel in the Union Army, and a variety of papers and documents, including 3 significant papers. One is a pattern of letters and numbers laid out along a grid, apparently the key to a secret code. The second is a hand-drawn map of the southern states, with important towns and landmarks noted, particularly in Virginia. Now that could be a getaway plan. Third is a letter dated March 27, signed only your friend Sam, in which the writer pleads that he cannot join Booth in the undertaking. Finally, I asked whether Booth was going to keep a horse. The clerk said that he generally hired one from Pumphrey Stable directly behind on C Street. There was a bay-colored man that he favored, very fast, and the clerk had seen Booth come and go on that horse several times in the afternoon of the 14th. He finally left at about 7 o'clock in the evening and never returned. John Wilkes Booth, Edmund Spangler, the stagehand, the unidentified Mr. Kinsler, and now the man known only as Sam. Growing evidence that this conspiracy is far larger than we first imagined. Now, we must turn our attention back to the Surratt boarding house, where my colleague, Detective Clarvo, is conducting a raid, the results of which not only confirmed our suspicions, but added to them. I have here the report he said. I see it all now. I told him that John Wilkes Booth had committed the crime and that John Surratt was suspected of the murder of Secretary Seward. By this time, Mary Surratt was in the parlor. I took her aside and warned her to be very particular about her answers, asked her where her son was. She said she had not seen him in 2 weeks, but admitted to having received a letter from him a few days earlier, postmarked in Canada. Further, when pressed, she admitted that John Wilkes Booth often visited the house to speak to her son, and that he was last there around 2 p.m. on Friday afternoon. Whiteman confirmed this. He said he arrived home that day at 2:30 and he encountered Booth leaving, and that Mrs. Surratt was holding a small wrapped package which he had not seen before. Then Mrs. Surratt asked Whiteman to drive her down to her tavern in Southern Maryland. They drove down together, delivering the package, and after supper returned to Washington by the Navy Yard Bridge. So, John Wilkes Booth and John Surratt are indeed connected, and possibly Mary Surratt as well. And though her son is not in the city, she chooses of all times Friday evening to deliver a package to her tavern in Southern Maryland, presumably from John Wilkes Booth to someone. Well, that begs the question, what other preparations might Mr. Booth have made, and with whom? But now, we must turn our attention to someone who's been forgotten in all of this. To be honest, even on his best days, no one paid much attention to Andrew Johnson, Vice President of the United States. So unimportant is he that he doesn't even have a residence here in Washington. He stays at the Kirkwood House Hotel at Pennsylvania and 12th Streets. Well, all the information coming and going between government officials on this evening, no one has heard from the Vice President. So now one question is larger than the other. Has the Vice President been murdered as well? Let's head to the Kirkwood House. The Kirkwood House Hotel is a fine 5-story hotel at Pennsylvania and 12th Streets, in which the Vice President has a suite on the first floor with windows facing 12th Street. When our detectives arrived, they were relieved to find that the Vice President was alive and well. He had gone to bed early Friday night and knew nothing of the evening's events until one of his fellow residents knocked on his door and informed him of the news. Our lead detective quickly realized, however, that this was just dumb luck, because this hotel has no security whatsoever. Now, you may have heard that you could at any point visit the White House and have an audience with the President. This was true. However, during the war, we had guards at the gate, as well as a handful of plainclothes officers inside the mansion itself. But there is no force whose sole responsibility is the protection of the President, and lesser officials have no bodyguards whatsoever. If you wanted to talk to the Vice President, or to shoot him, you need simply knock on his door in the Kirkwood House Hotel. Realizing this, our lead detective, John Lee, quickly set up a security perimeter and then commenced a search. I have here Detective Lee's reports. I began to search the building when I was approached by the bartender. He wished to inform me of a strange man who had taken a room the day before. A German fellow, shabbily dressed and unshaven, who kept asking where Mr. Johnson's room was. I spoke with the desk clerk who produced the hotel register. He pointed out the fellow's signature. George Atzerodt of Charles County, Maryland. Atzerodt had paid for the entire day in advance, which was no small amount, and taken room 126 on the floor directly above the Vice President. With the permission of the hotel, I broke in the door of room 126. The room contained no special items, except for a black coat hanging on the wall. I searched the bed. Under the pillow, I found a loaded revolver. When I turned the mattress over, I found a Bowie knife hidden there. I then went through the coat's pockets and found a bank book. It was issued by the Ontario Bank in Montreal, Canada, and notes the enormous balance of $455. The account is the name of Mr. J. Wilkes Booth. No one has seen Atzerodt since around 10 p.m. when he staggered into the bar, having apparently been drinking elsewhere. The bartender said that he looked extremely troubled and downed several more drinks before abruptly running out of the hotel. Well, what are we to make of George Atzerodt? It would appear that he was in the employ of Booth, with the room above the Vice President, the money, as well as the provisions, the weapons. It would appear that Mr. Atzerodt vice president. But he couldn't do it, even with more than a few drinks in him for liquid courage. But the question then becomes, why did he run out of the hotel just after 10 p.m.? Let me ask you, deputies, what else occurred in this city Friday, April 14th, just after 10 p.m.? Lincoln was shot just after 10 p.m. Also, we learned the attack on the Secretary of State at his home in Lafayette Park occurred just after 10 p.m. So if Mr. Axelrod was intended to kill the Vice President, it would appear that act was meant to coincide with the others, thus increasing the chaos. But he couldn't do it. So one explanation is that he left the hotel because he knew what else was happening in the city, and he didn't want to wait around to see what might happen to him. But another possible explanation is that he left the Kirkwood House Hotel, went to the Stewart home just a few short blocks away, and carried out the bloody attack there. So if the witnesses at the Stewart home give a description of a frightened German man as their attacker, we'll have our answer. We're going to head in the direction of the Stewart home, but we have one more lead to follow before we get there. A late Friday night, a stableman came into police headquarters. He wished to report a man who had checked out a horse from him earlier in the day, but failed to return it. Well, we had no time to hunt down any scofflaws, nor did we have any stolen horses. But we took the man's information and sent him on his way. It wasn't until later we realized the importance of what he had shared with us. You see, the horse thief, if he was one, was in the company of a regular customer of the stable, a German fellow by the name of Axelrod. The stableman's name is John Fletcher, and he works here at Thompson Naylor Stables at E and 13th Streets. I have here a statement from John Fletcher. I'm very strict about hiring horses. I don't allow anybody to have one out after 8 p.m. But George Axelrod came in Friday afternoon and said he needed to pick up a horse about 10 p.m. Says I knew him? I said yes. Then this friend of his, Harold is his name, David Harold, said he needed a horse right then, and how late could he keep him out? Well, something out about them riding around so late, but I figured I had to wait for Axelrod anyway, so 10 o'clock, but no later. Axelrod showed up for his horse a little before 10. I think he'd been drinking, and rolled off. Now, I had a feeling him and Harold must be up to no good, and I thought about following him, but as I crossed E Street, here comes David Harold riding from the direction of the Treasury. I said, you get off that horse right now, you've had him long enough. Well, he took one look at me, put spurs to him, charged right up 13th Street. I can see him tearing around on F Street heading east. Now, I was sure something was the matter, so I saddled up a horse and rode hell in from leather from the Navy Yard Bridge. Axelrod's from Southern Maryland. I figured if those two was in a horse thievery, they'd head that way. Sure enough, the guard at the bridge said two men had ridden up separately just 15 minutes earlier, and he let them both cross. Now, nobody's supposed to be allowed to cross after 9 p.m. They both had excuses. Second man said his name was Smith, but from the description, 25, average height. I'm sure it was Harold. First one wasn't a German fellow at all. Was more of a gentleman in black with a Maine mare, which had been ridden pretty hard. Said he just wanted to get home to Charles County. Said his name was Booth. Well, there it is. John Wilkes Booth has escaped over the Navy Yard Bridge into Maryland. With a little help, fresh horses, and a boat, he can be in Virginia in a day and a half. And from there, who knows? Our frightened German friend, George Axelrod, on the other hand, appears no more capable of injuring the Secretary of State than he was of murdering the Vice President. But David Harold was riding from the direction of the Stewart home, and within the hour escaped across the Navy Yard Bridge with John Wilkes Booth. So if the witnesses at the Stewart home give a description of a frightened, or rather a 25 average height, we'll have our second assassin. Let's head toward the Stewart home. The Stewart home sits here in Lafayette Park, and directly next door, on the southeast corner of Madison Place and Pennsylvania Avenue, is the headquarters of the Defense of Washington. That night, 3 young soldiers came out to take the evening air. Across the room they saw 2 horses. One had a man standing next to it, and the other was saddled and bridled and tied to a fence surrounding the park. The soldiers thought nothing of this, and went back inside their headquarters, only to emerge a few minutes later to the screams of a young woman. Those screams came from the fine 3-story home directly next door. The home of Secretary of State Stewart, his wife, his 2 grown sons, Frederick and Augustus, broke his arm as well as his jaw. He was being attended to that night by an Army nurse, Sergeant Robinson, and his young daughter, Fanny Stewart. The story goes that approximately 5 minutes after 10 p.m., a man came to the door claiming he had medicine for the secretary. This made sense, so the servants allowed that man entry to the home. Moments later, there was a scuffle at the top of the stairs, and Fanny Stewart says that the door then burst open into her room, or rather her father's room. Her brother, Frederick, his side of his face bloody, was struggling with the assassin, who had in one hand a pistol, and the other a knife. The assassin threw Frederick down, leapt onto the bed, and began slashing wildly at the Secretary of State, who was somehow able to roll himself off the bed. At that point, the other two men, Frederick and the Army nurse, Sergeant Robinson, both tried to subdue the assassin. They did not do so. He was able to throw them off and rush headlong down the stairs. Following that traumatic incident, the Secretary of State had his jaw slashed open very badly, and his son Frederick lay at the top of the stairs with a pretty severe head wound. Out front, on Madison Place, the soldiers who re-emerged from their headquarters saw the first man, almost certainly David Harold, leap onto his horse and head south toward the Treasury. Moments later, the assassin emerged from the Stewart home, leaping onto the other horse. He headed north on Madison Place. The soldiers gave chase on foot, but could not catch him. Their description: a tall, muscular man in a brown hat and light overcoat. A description that perfectly matches the description that Mrs. Martha Murray gave us of Mr. Kensler at the Herndon House Hotel. Now, it wasn't long before we were able to complete the list of those potentially involved in this conspiracy, and I will tell you about them now. As Booth and the pursuit of Booth and Harold into Maryland began, we learned that Booth had the injuries that he almost certainly sustained while leaping from the presidential box treated by Dr. Samuel Mudd in Charles County, Maryland. Dr. Mudd helped Booth and Harold further into Maryland and thence to Virginia. Next, we have Samuel Arnold, the Sam of the letter found at the National Hotel. Longtime friend of Booth's from Baltimore County, he claims that the undertaking outlined in his letter was a plot to kidnap the president, but not to kill him. He was arrested at his home in Baltimore on April 17th. Also arrested on April 17th at her home on H Street, her boarding house, was Mary Surratt. While the police were there, a tall, muscular man came to the door, claiming he was hired to dig a gutter. A card in his pocket identified as Lewis Payne, one of the many aliases of Lewis Powell. Another alias, Mr. Kensler. He was taken into custody. Our frightened German friend, George Atzerodt, avoided capture for nearly a week, despite his tendency to make knowing comments to anyone who would listen about the assassination. Thanks to a tip, he was arrested at his cousin's home in Germantown, Maryland on April the 20th. Finally, we have Edmund Spangler, the Forest Theater stagehand. He was tracked down to a boarding house on April 15th. He was arrested, briefly questioned, then released, but arrested again on April 17th. Of Booth and Harold, I'll tell you more in a moment. Now, deputies, can anyone tell me what this building is? Very good. This is the White House. It's the oldest public building in Washington. George Washington himself laid the cornerstone in 1792, when every president since John Adams moved in 1800 has resided in the Executive Mansion. The second floor of the home is where the family quarters are, and over here, this window here, belongs to the room of 12-year-old Tad Lincoln. There's a story about Tad and his father that occurred on the evening of April 11th. A crowd had amassed here in front of the White House to hear the president speak on the end of the war. He appeared in this window directly above the main entry, with an aide holding a lantern, and 12-year-old Tad holding the pages of his speech. The story goes that the president asked the crowd rhetorically what was to be done with the rebels. Someone in the crowd screamed, "Hang them," to which young Tad Lincoln said, "No, we must hang on to them." The president looked to his son, and then to the crowd and said, "That's right, we must hang on to them," and then went on to outline his plans for reuniting the country. In the crowd that evening were Lewis Whiteman, the boarder from the Surratt boarding house, as well as John Wilkes Booth. According to Whiteman, Booth said, and I quote, "That is the last speech he will ever give." Abraham Abraham Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. on Saturday, April the 15th, in the back room of Peterson's boarding house. Shortly thereafter, he was taken in a plain wood coffin by carriage back to the White House. At 11 o'clock that morning, in his suite at the Kirkwood House Hotel, Andrew Johnson took the oath of office as the 17th President of the United States. 4 days later, funeral services were held in the Great East Room of the White House for President Lincoln, the beginning of his long trip home to Springfield, Illinois. Now, this is where the facts of the case conclude, but there's one question I must put to each of you directly. If and when these conspirators come to trial, how would you find them in the following charges? Murderously and treasonously killing Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States. Laying in wait to murder Andrew Johnson, Vice President of the United States, and attempting to murder William Seward, Secretary of State of the United States. We will now go through the conspirators, and as we do so, we will, by a show of hands, determine their guilt or innocence, and I will give you some insider information.
Okay,
For beginning, Samuel Arnold. Samuel letter found at the National Hotel. So willing to kidnap the president, but not to kill him. How many say he is guilty in this conspiracy?
You think he was
With
guilty?
his hands. How many say he is not guilty? Mr. Arnold is found guilty, sentenced to life in prison. Next, we have Dr. Samuel Mudd. Claims he did not know either man he was helping in Southern Maryland. How many feel that Dr. Mudd, who treated Booth's injuries, is guilty in this conspiracy?
Guilty?
How many feel Dr. Mudd is not guilty? Dr. Mudd was found guilty, sentenced to life in prison. Next, we have Edmund Spangler, the Ford Theater stagehand, who arranged to have Booth's horse waiting for him to make his escape. How many feel that Mr. Spangler is guilty in this conspiracy? How many feel he is not guilty? Mr. Spangler was found not guilty.
Oh, one person got it right.
However, for aiding and abetting in Booth's escape, he was given 6 years in prison. A rather unique not guilty verdict. Next is George Atzerodt, our frightened German friend. It's been a drunken evening in the city. He was assigned to kill the vice president. He did not kill him. How many say he is guilty in this conspiracy?
Guilty?
How many say not guilty? Mr. Atzerodt was found guilty, sentenced to death. Next we have Lewis Powell, who carried out the bloody attack, slashing open the face of the Secretary of State and injuring his son. How many say he is guilty in this conspiracy? How many say he is not guilty? Very good, he was indeed found guilty, sentenced to death. Next we have Mary Surratt. She has the boarding house on 8th Street, delivered that package of Booth, turned out to be field glasses, much like binoculars. How many say that she is guilty in this conspiracy?
Is she guilty?
How many say she is not guilty? Mary Surratt was found guilty. She was sentenced to death.
Oh!
She is the first woman ever executed by the federal government. Her lovely rat-faced son, John Surratt, central to the conspiracy, providing housing, horses, and financing, also thought to be a Confederate spy. How many say that he is guilty in this conspiracy?
Guilty?
How many say that he is not guilty? It's an interesting story. He escaped first to Canada, then to Europe, where he served briefly in Vatican City as a guard to the Pope. He was finally tracked down in Egypt in 1867, brought back to the United States, put on trial. The jury could not arrive at a verdict. He went free. He lived to be 72 years old and never spoke publicly in defense of his mother. Quite a son. Next we have David Harold. He assisted in the bloody attack at the Stewart home and escaped with John Wilkes Booth into Virginia, apprehended in Fort Wayne, Virginia on April the 26th. How many say he is guilty in this conspiracy? How many say not guilty? He was found guilty, sentenced to death. Finally, we have John Wilkes Booth, murderer of the president. How many say that he is guilty? How many say he is not guilty? Well, Mr. Booth never came to trial. He was tracked down to a barn in Fort Wayne, Virginia on April 26th. He refused to come out of that barn. It was then set on fire. He still refused to come out. At that point, a Union sniper had a shot between two boards. He took it, striking Booth in the neck, paralyzing him from the neck down. A few hours later, he lay on his deathbed on the front porch of a farmhouse. He asked that someone hold his hands in front of him, as he could not. They did so. And his final words were, useless. Useless. These are the facts of the case. In the same streets that we have seen in many of the same locations, But I wish to leave you with one final thought. The goal of John Wilkes Booth String conspiracy was not simply to kill President Abraham Lincoln. He wanted to bring down the federal government at its moment of greatest triumph, to divide this country again through a singular and unprecedented crime. But John Wilkes Booth's great conspiracy was the very real thing. Useless. Useless. The government stands, the White House stands, the Union stands. That our investigation is complete. Thank you for joining me today. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
If you have any questions, you're welcome to email them to me and we can answer them and clarify anything if there's anything that we left. Yeah? Okay. Good, thank you. Well, have a great rest of your week and a great summer.